Hello and welcome to the Daily Journal's Capitol View webcast. I'm your host, Chris Kiefer, managing editor for multimedia here at the Daily Journal. And as always, we are joined in Jackson by Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison. Bobby, how's it going today?
All right, Chris, how you doing?
Good, doing well. I guess the session is kind of kicking up for you now that we're a couple weeks into it, and some of the routine stuff at the beginning has gotten going. I guess to start off with, maybe one of the biggest issues that's going on right now, you wrote about it over the weekend, is school choice and a couple of key bills or school choice. And I guess today is an appropriate day to talk about that because today's a day that a lot of advocates for school choice are gathered for, I guess, a rally at the state capitol. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was a rally this morning. There was several hundred school children and other people in support of essentially a voucher program. They were in the Capitol this morning, and there's going to be a big push to expand what we refer to in the past here is just a special voucher program for special needs children. They're planning to expand that to open it up for more children, just for sort of the general school population on a limited basis, but there's going to be a big push to do that this session. And if it passes, that'll be a big sort of feather in the cap of the school choice advocates here in Mississippi.
Tell us a little bit more. That legislation, I guess, even a local tie, was written, I guess, by Nancy Collins, former state senator out of Tupelo. I don't remember, Bobby, if you remember the year. I mean, I'd say it was roughly, about 3 years ago? Kind of walk us through that.
2015.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 2015 when it finally passed, and that legislation would provide a little less than $6,500 per student for a limited number of special needs children to pursue their educational opportunities in private schools. The first year it was in effect, if it was enacted, it had they didn't fill out the slots. There was a limited, and I can't remember now how many slots are, Chris. You have my story there in front of you, might tell you, but they didn't fill all those slots. So the next year they expanded, or a couple of years later, they expanded the legislation to allow children who were already in a special needs child already in the private schools to apply for those scholarships or vouchers. So that kind of they were able to fill all the slots when they expanded the legislation. Now this year the plan is to expand the legislation to up to, I think it was in
let's see. I couldn't find the other number, Bobby, but that number it would be capped at 0.5% of public school enrollment, or 2,500 students the first year, and grow by 1% every year.
Yeah, and the first priority would still go to the special needs kids, but then it would be opened up to other kids. In one version of the legislation, you had to be, I believe it was 250% of the federal poverty level to apply, or at least you'd get, if you were within 250% of the federal poverty level, you would have you'd be prioritized over children who from more affluent families. So that's the plan this year, as far as supported by Governor Phil Bryant and Speaker Tate Reeves, Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves and Speaker Philip Gunn to expand that program to just sort of the general school population, and it would be a little bit less than what the base student costs of what students are being get now for just it'd be a little bit less than what a public school student gets to go to that the school district gets to pay for a public school student.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
I'm sorry, Chris. I'm kind of muddling around a little bit, and I just been to the eye doctor, and my eyes probably look funny, but it's just the fact they've been dilated, and I guess it's affecting my ability to speak too. But I try to get a little bit more on task as we move forward here, and so sorry about that, but
no, you're good. You're good. Having your eyes dilated, the eye doctor throws everything off. I know it. It's a weird feeling. So, back on the base student cost, Bobby. I'm looking at that. It would be 95%. Your story said of the base student cost is what the value of special needs scholarship would be. And I'm assuming that base student cost. Assuming we'll talk as we go later in the program about this effort to rewrite the state funding formula, school funding formula. And where that is. But if that were to pass, I'm assuming that's the base student cost that they'd be talking about, which right now is $4,800 in that bill.
Yeah, and that's a good question. And if the school funding formula was rewritten, it would reduce the base student cost. So I'm not sure how that would affect the voucher bill. They may, this is all in the process, so they might change the definition of how much a student would get under the voucher bill if the base student cost was changed as a result of another piece of legislation dealing with the school funding formula. So it all gets kind of complicated. So, but that's a good point.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that, but while we're still on the school choice issue, I mean, kind of what are the odds? You mentioned all the leadership's behind it, so there's that. And I also noticed that the Senate bill was written by Gray Tollison, who's the Senate Education Chair. My hunch would be the Senate. It would have a pretty good chance. The House seems to be a little more resistant on some school choice issues. Kind of, where do you see it?
Yeah, that's. I think that's a safe assumption. That's kind of conventional wisdom. That I think it'd be my general impression is it's going to be a tight vote in the Senate too, but I think it'll probably start in the Senate just because the school choice advocates feel they have a better shot in the Senate. Now, it was interesting, as we talked about earlier in this program a couple of weeks ago, we have a new House Education Committee chair, the John Moore, the longtime chair, at least the chair for the past 6 years of the House Education Committee, stepped down right before the session began in January. And so Speaker Gunn appointed a new chair, Richard Bennett, a Republican from Gulfport, or not from Gulfport, but from the Gulf Coast, from Long Beach, to chair the House Education Committee. And it was interesting that many of the school choice advocates were opposed to his appointment. So I mean, there's a perception at least that Bennett may not be as amenable to school choice bills as John Moore, the previous chair, was, and so it might be so that the Education Committee chair in the House, may be a stumbling block to school choice himself. So we just have to see how that goes as the session progresses. But I do think that it's a toss up of whether those voucher bills can get out of the legislature this session, whether they can pass.
So again, looking at this bill, it would again cap a certain number of students who could use it. That would start at 2,500 students statewide and grow. But the original bill, from the way I remember it, Bobby, and correct me if this is wrong, but you had to kind of have a reason, I guess, and maybe that's a certain special needs diagnosis for saying public school isn't meeting my services, isn't meeting my needs. I can't get the services I need to get the service I need somewhere else. Under this bill, would you have to have a similar, to say, justification?
No. Okay. You under the original law, under the law as it stands now, you have to have a special education diagnosis. Now it could be, there's several diagnoses. It could be something real serious, or or it could be something dealing with autism, or it could be something that's much easier to deal with, such as just a speech, needing to get to see a speech therapist for a while. But you had to have a IEP, as they call it, individual educational plan. That may not be right either. But you had to have
program, I think. But yeah, that's right.
Diagnosis before you could get the scholarship or voucher. But under this bill, proposed bill, those people would still get the first, within that 2,500 students, those special needs students would still be the first priority. But then after that, it'd be opened up to other just general education, just general students who are just, just going through the regular school process and curriculum.
Sure, and they wouldn't have to say the reason I'm taking this is because the public school isn't doing X or Y. It's just
right.
It would just be open for anybody. Yeah. Got it. I guess moving on, looking at I'm trying to think if there's anything else we hadn't covered on that, but we'll move on now. Talk about the funding debate. We kind of referenced it a little bit, and you talked about Richard Bennett, the House Education Chair, in reference to school choice. But one place where I guess he has really carved a spot already in this session is his work on the education funding formula, which moved quickly through the House last week and is now already moved on to the Senate. Kind of walk us through where we are on that.
It's the effort to write the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, which, was a school funding formula that passed in 1997. At that time, it was considered sort of landmark, legislation. Mississippi received national attention for passing that legislation. Most people attribute that legislation for Mississippi not being sued and losing an equity funding lawsuit such that occurred in so many other states where, there was lawsuits saying, a child in a certain part of a state didn't receive as good as education as students in other more affluent parts of the states. But that didn't ever happen in Mississippi, in part because of the MAEP. But now the leadership in the House and Senate are trying to rewrite it with a new funding formula, and it passed the House last week. They took it up in committee, I think, on a Tuesday, and passed out of committee, and it passed on a House floor, I think, on Wednesday or Thursday, and now it goes to the Senate. This will be a significant change if the legislation does become law. The old MAEP, it's kind of a, people say it's complicated, but it's really not complicated. It's just State Department of Education is charged with just taking officially run C or average school districts, determine how much money it costs to educate a child in those districts, and then guaranteeing each school in the state that amount of money. But each school is responsible for providing a certain amount of the money itself, based on, the more affluent districts with more property to tax, they have to provide more to local match, whereas poor districts do not provide as much of the local match. Now, there's a growth factor in the MAEP, and there's also a mandate that it, to be fully funded. Of course, the flip side of that is it hadn't been fully funded, but twice since it was totally enacted in 2003, and that's been a constant sore spot in the sort of legislative process. The leadership, I think, wants to rewrite this formula because they tired of hearing that they're underfunded education, so they're coming with a new formula that it'll be easier to won't take as much money to fund, and it also doesn't have the growth factor in it. So that will be make it easier for them to fund also. And this formula, it would be based on a base cost, which is kind of this was determined in the House bill. It was sort of the midpoint of what was recommended by consultants that was hired to develop this formula for the state. $4,800 per student. Now there'd be weights added for there'd be additional money for special needs students, for gifted students, for students who speak of who were students who were English as a second language for them, and for other groups there'd be additional money. But the bottom line is this formula will not produce as much money for the local school districts as the MAEP would if it was fully funded.
Sure, I think the figure was, or what the Speaker Gunn said, was that over 7 years there'd be $107 million more than what schools are getting today. They would get under this formula. But the comparison is that schools today are already 60 something million less than full funding. So I guess the amount they get in 7 years is still less than what full funding would be in today's dollars, correct?
Yeah. And 107 million over 7 years. We consider, bless you, when you consider the average inflation rate, which is not even in recent times where inflation has been relatively tame and very low, still the 107 million over 7 years would probably not keep up with inflation.
But the other, I guess, important point, Bobby, it seems like maybe the philosophy behind this bill, or the philosophical change from the old bill to the new bill, you had a line in a column that you had written, I guess maybe it was last Thursday, looking back kind of at MAEP, and one of the lines that struck me about it was something to the effect that when MAEP was passed in 1997, the thought process was that because education is so important, we're going to remove it from the whims of the legislature and have an objective formula to say that basically determines this is how much money is needed to fund an C-level school district, and so this is how much money schools should get. The philosophy behind this, I guess, is more the legislature wasn't able to meet that money, but more it puts that power back to the legislature, I guess, rather than having an objective formula that says you have to figure out how to come up with this money. It gives the legislature the leeway each year to determine how much money. I mean, am I stating that correctly?
Yeah, right. And I mean, there is, and they didn't just pull this base student cost out of the thin air. It was based on studies, but it gives the legislature each year the discretion to determine what the base student cost is. And when you can determine the base student cost, you can always set the base student cost at an amount where you can say you fully funded education, whereas you don't have an objective formula, it just doesn't say, who's to say what full funding of education is. And, if you look at, how we compare nationally, we're near the bottom, 47th, 48th in school funding, and this is not going to do anything to move us from that position. And at the point to stress here, Chris, I think even if the MAEP had ever been fully funded, we would still be near the bottom in per pupil expenditure. So it's not like the MAEP just produced an outrageous amount of money for the school districts. But it gave the school districts what was determined by a bunch of experts at the time to be the amount of money needed to provide a adequate education, and but it also gave the school districts, local school districts, the authority to levy more taxes locally to get beyond that adequate level, if you will. And most school districts have tried to do that. Tupelo, you probably know this better than I do, Chris, but I think they're near the cap.
They are at the cap, 55 mills. That's right.
So there's been an effort on the local level to do more. But what the MAP did was attempted to guarantee a certain level of funding that the school district could count on each year.
Sure. And another thing, I know MAP was basically set up so that more property poor districts got more money to make up for their struggles to generate as much local tax and to try to make it more equitable. Does this formula do that, other than, I know it gives more funds to students who come from impoverished families would have more than the higher base student cost? Is there anything beyond that would kind of divvy up the funds more for districts that need it more?
Yeah, there is, Chris, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing in a formula. Actually, that portion of the MAP is not changed under the current MAP law. Each school district is, say, for instance, the base student cost, just because you and I probably aren't very good at math, is $1,000 per student. Of course, it's a good bit more than that, but just say $1,000 per student. Each school district would be responsible for levying 28 meals towards that $1,000 per student, or 27% of the total cost. So they'd be responsible for levying 28 meals or $270, whichever is less. Mm-hmm. And so this does not change that. That part of the law remains in effect. I mean, of course, backing up a meal is just a taxing unit. It's I think 1/1000th of assessed property value. I believe that's right. And right. So one flaw that a lot of people pointed out with MAP that's occurred through the years. It didn't start out this way, but now a lot of school districts. There's a lot of affluent school districts in the state that are having that just put that 27% towards the base student cost, and they only have to get up to 28 meals to get to base student cost. So in effect, the argument can be made that the state is kind of subsidizing some of the more wealthy school districts, including Tupelo. Tupelo is one of those being that don't have to levy the 28 meals towards the base student cost because they can provide 27% at a lower rate than that. And there's some that believe that 27% cap should be removed to make it a fair formula, whether it's the MAP or whether it's the new funding formula. Now the flip side of that is that it would cost Tupelo about $5 million, a little less than $5 million, I think, if you remove that cap. There'd something like it cost the Pascagoula School District, I think, $17 million. So if they did that, they'd have to do it over an extended period of time, just so as not to be too big a hit on those school districts.
Sure. Essentially, I guess it gives the school districts more local funds to be able to, since they don't have to put the 28 mils, they can put more on top. It's a supplemental formula.
Yeah. You can argue Tupelo is able to put more local funds above the base student cost than say Nettleton or Baldwin or Pontotoc.
Sure.
Or just about any other school district in Northeast Mississippi.
So the new formula is through the House, and again, it passed through the House in less than a week. It's in the Senate now. What are you hearing? What are you expecting to happen there?
Oh, I mean, I think it's going to be taken up. I don't think the Senate's going to necessarily put it on the fast track, but I do think it'll be taken up in the Senate. I think, I think their goal is to pass it. I assume that they'll make some changes in it, and it'll go back to the House, and the House could accept those changes or invite conference to try to work out the differences. But who knows? There's, the leadership has put such a priority on passing this that there's a possibility the Senate could just take the House bill as is, pass it, and send it to the governor, and be sort of over before we knew it. But we had to see how that happens.
Sure. Bobby, moving on to another issue that you wrote about last week, Brandon Presley, Public Service Commissioner for the northern part of the state, who is from Nettleton, from Lee County, former mayor of Nettleton. He made an announcement last week. I think there were some people who were thinking of him as a possible contender for the U.S. Senate seat that's held by Roger Wicker. I guess Presley's a Democrat, so would have run on the Democratic side of the ticket. But anyway, he announced last week that he was not gonna throw his hat in that election, in that race. Tell us more about that.
Well, he was he was courted by national Democrats as a possible contender to challenge Wicker in the who also is a Northeast Mississippi and a Pontotoc native and a Tupelo resident, to challenge Wicker in the election this year, but he opted not to do that. There's a feeling that he is a Democrat, one of the few Democrats in the state who has a little name identification, who could run a credible statewide campaign. He's a very good public speaker, very good communicator. He's Elvis's cousin, so he's got a lot going for him. And so the thinking is he'll run in 2019 in the state elections in 2019 for his Public Service Commission post, where he serves as the chairman of that 3-member commission right now, or he could run for another statewide office, Secretary of State. There's probably going to be an open seat, or even run for lieutenant governor. So we just have to see what he decides to do. Now, interestingly, Chris, there's some speculation that Thad Cochran, the state's senior U.S. senator, is going to resign this year, and because of ill health, if he resigned, it'd be a special election in November. Also, now he did not say he would not be a candidate in that race if Thad Cochran did resign. So we just had to see if that occurs. But as far as challenging Wicker that doesn't appear it's going to happen. No, it's not going to happen.
Sure. So I guess kind of what it means for both candidates. For Brandon Presley, first of all, you said he didn't rule off if the other Senate election comes open, but people are also looking at him statewide, whether he keeps his current seat, seeks another state office. In terms of his current seat, I know he had some comments to you, some goals that he's trying to focus on while he's there. He talked about expanding broadband to rural areas, natural gas service, I believe, too. Does that sound right?
Yeah. He said that he wants to focus on that as a Public Service Commission chair of the Public Service Commission. Also, he wants to focus on, he was we don't focus too much on it in Northeast Mississippi because we're TVA. We get our power through the TVA. But also, he's been he was an early on outspoken critic of the Kemper coal-powered plant that was going to use sort of a new technology to develop electricity for Mississippi Power down on the coast. And that's just turned out to be just a real bust, costing the ratepayers down there a good bit of money, and really affecting Mississippi Power. And he was an outspoken critic of that from the beginning. He said he wants to continue to focus on that issue as Public Service Commissioner. So I could see him running for re-election in 2019, but also could see him running for any office below governor. Of course, he's not an attorney, so he couldn't run for attorney general, but he could run for Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor, or those are the two primary ones that we know there's going to be openings, vacancies in those two offices.
Sure. Then looking at the flip side, Roger Wicker in that election. Right now there's no one else that I'm aware of that has entered that election. I know there's always that possibility. You know, people have talked about Chris McDaniel and what he may do, and of course he hasn't announced his intentions one way or the other yet. But kind of tell us about what you're hearing on that election, and am I right now Wicker's the only candidate that's announced, correct?
You're correct. McDaniel challenged Cochran, almost beat him in 2014 in the Republican primary. There's been some thought that he would challenge Wicker in the Republican primary this year. He was a sort of a ally of Steve Bannon, who's been, on the national level, who's been in the news lately. He's was a Trump supporter of President Trump, and he's kind of following that with President Trump in recent weeks because of his comments he apparently made in a book. So there's thought that, Steve Bannon may not have the access to money that he might have had before. So that might affect McDaniel's ability to challenge Wicker in a primary. In the general, as far as Democrats, the name I've heard, and it'd be a long shot, I think, but David Berria, the House Democratic leader from down on the Gulf Coast, there's some thought that he might run for the Senate seat on the Democratic side.
Sure. I guess wrapping this up, Bobby, a couple of things, just kind of looking ahead at this week, in a quick summary, looking back, we like to do at the end of the show when we're talking when the legislature's in session, a couple of highlights, I guess, from the week, most impactful lawmaker, most impactful legislation, and the strangest moment of the week. So take us through some of those from last week.
Well, I think the most impactful legislation by far is what we spent a good bit of time talking about is the rewrite of the MAEP. That bill is, passed the House already this early in the session, and, stands a good chance of passing the Senate. So that by far is the most impactful legislation, and just sort of continuing that same theme. The most bizarre thing, Chris, of the week, during the debate on that legislation on the House floor, the Democrats, I think, offered 17 amendments. Some of the amendments were well thought out, some were not well thought out. But in each instance, the Democrats came up with in some instances with prepared speeches and had a lot of facts and figures and stuff. And they presented their case, and Richard Bennett just stood up and just essentially said, he just asked the House to oppose the amendment. In each instance, the amendment was defeated, and it just shows, in the old days, there's been talk through the years about how bad the legislature was under, say, former chair, Senate. Speakers going back to, say, Buddy Newman, who sort of had in the 80s and 70s had a reputation of running the House sort of with an iron fist and limiting debate. But even in that time, Chris, you had people were kind of forced. There was no the coalitions were not so strong that people would vote without listening to the issues, but you had the chairman or whomever had to kind of state his case and make his case. But in the new legislature, where partisanship is such a key factor, in many instances, and including on the rewrite of this important bill, the leadership had its votes so sewed up that there was no debate. It was just like just oppose this amendment. And the amendment went down, but the Republican majority defeated the amendment without even having to hear both sides of the argument. And it should be pointed out that some of those amendments were amendments that Republicans have run on in the past and campaigned on, and said these changes in law were needed. And there was instances where Democrats offered amendments that would accomplish those goals, but it wasn't part of the leadership's plan. So the amendment was just defeated, sort of summarily defeated without any debate. Wow. And I thought that was the most striking example. That's been going on for a while under Democrats and Republicans, but I thought that was one of the most striking examples of that I've seen lately.
Yeah, that's interesting. One last, just we'll wrap up. But before we go, Bobby, this week, anything big on tap? Anything you're expecting to happen?
Just there's going to be a lot of committee meetings. We're really getting kicked off. You're gonna start. You seeing bills come out of committee and get on a House and Senate floor. We have next couple of weeks be watching to see if anything actually occurs in the lottery. We're going to have important stuff on Medicaid as far as how Medicaid is going to be rewritten to whether hospitals are going to be allowed to run managed care companies and get some of that business. There's going to be just a bunch of key pieces of legislation being taken up in the coming 2 weeks.
Sure. Well, that'll give us plenty to talk about, and you'll be able to follow all that coverage in the Daily Journal or at djournal.com. Read all Bobby Harrison's stories there and find out more about what's going on in the legislature. So that does it for another episode of Capitol View. We thank you for joining us. We remind you can catch us each week. Usually we're Monday at 2. Sometimes, as this week, schedules change that timing, and we'll usually post the latest on our Twitter account at djournalnow. But anyway, you can catch us live whenever we're on at djournal.com, and our replay is also there at djournal.com as well as on our Facebook page. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. Bobby, thank you, and have a great week.